What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with a new daily video. All of the stories therein are new to this channel as well as I can keep track of. So if you guys end up enjoying this video and you guys are enjoying these daily videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. It really helps the video to do well and ensures I can keep making these videos daily for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts you'd like to share in the comments, either about the stories or the video itself, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I may not always be able to respond to them. Either way, I'm gonna let you guys enjoy the next hour or so of true scary stories, and I'll see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I had a really scary experience when I was a little girl, around the age of 8 years old. This might be a little intense, so please be warned about that ahead of time. An aunt of mine had her house burned down, and very unfortunately, she also died in the fire. However, the firemen were able to save my 6-year-old cousin. Of course, she experienced something that would disturb her for the rest of her life. My aunt had been a single mother. She hadn't seen or heard from the father in years, so he wasn't able to take custody of his daughter. For a while, she came to live with us. My mom thought that if she was with a girl of her age, it would help her get better. It was really hard living with her and trying to get her to do anything. I used to love tea parties and would hold them often. I couldn't really get her to take part in them at all, though. She would just understandably sit there silently and look sad. She rarely talked, and the only time she once did was to say, "That cup is empty," as if she didn't know we were supposed to just be playing. The girl slept in the same room as me, as I had 2 twin beds in the room. It was fine, and for the most part she seemed to sleep well. Occasionally, though, she would have very bad nightmares and would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. My mom would always come to the room and grab her, hug her tight, and try to make her feel better. I have to admit, I didn't like having her around. At only 8 years old, I guess I couldn't really appreciate what she was going through. I feel really bad about that now, especially since I've never had to lose my mom. But something about her creeped me out. She was always so quiet, only communicating with people mostly with nods and shakes of the head. She would occasionally walk into the room and look around at everyone without coming in, and sit down in place. Then, after a while, she would turn around and leave without a word. It was kind of creepy. One time, my mom took us for a walk. We lived in a 2nd-story apartment. When we left the apartment, she stopped and looked at the window to it. I tried to get her to keep walking, but she didn't want to. My mom didn't notice at first, and didn't notice when I asked the girl what she was looking at. In a very rare moment of her actually talking, she told me, "Mommy is in the window." Of course, that chilled me, and I didn't want much to do with her. When my mom came over and told us to keep up, she went ahead and started walking alongside my mom. As I looked up at the window, though, I thought I saw a woman standing behind the sheer curtain. I felt my heart jump in my chest. I ran forward and grabbed my mother's hand. After that, I began to get a little bit scared of that house. I normally didn't, but that experience was enough to be pretty terrifying. The scariest thing, though, happened at night, and if I recall, it was about a week after what we saw in the window that day. My cousin and I were pretty soundly sleeping when I heard some sort of creaking noise that woke me up from my sleep. I looked over at my cousin's bed, only to notice that she was sitting up in it. She was rocking back and forth, and that was what was making the creaking sound. She was just doing it over and over again. I called out to her, trying to get her attention. However, she wouldn't respond to me in any way. She just kept rocking back and forth, staring at a certain area. I turned and looked to where she was looking at, only to realize that it was the bedroom closet door, and the door was wide open. We always kept the door closed when we were sleeping. I asked my cousin if she saw her mom in the closet again, remembering what she'd told me about last week. At first, she didn't respond, but when I asked her again, she turned and looked at me. "That's not my mommy in the closet," she told me. I looked back to the closet and saw the shadow of a person standing inside. I screamed for my mom at the top of my lungs. My mom rushed into the room and immediately turned on the lights. She saw that both of us girls were terrified and asked what was going on. I told her someone was hiding in our bedroom closet. My mom went in and searched, but somehow she didn't find anything. Both of us assured her that we'd really seen it though. My mom took us both into her room and let us sleep with her that night. Although we didn't sleep great, it was the only way either of us could have gotten any sleep at all. My cousins stayed with us for about another 3 months. After that, a paternal aunt asked my mom if she could take custody of the young girl. My mom was okay with that, mostly because the aunt was very wealthy and she thought she could provide a better life for her. I didn't see that cousin ever again. After she left, I didn't see any figures in the window either, or in that closet ever again. I went back to sleeping comfortably in my own room. I was around 12 years old when this happened. It was a Saturday morning, and my parents were going out of town for the weekend. They left my older brother to babysit, but as soon as they left pretty much, he did too. Yeah, great brother, I know. So I'm sitting there in the living room watching TV by myself when the doorbell suddenly rings. Instead of looking through the peephole like a normal person, I flung the door open, eager for company. I thought it would be my neighbor, not two middle-aged men I'd never seen before looking down at me. "Hi there, are your parents home?" I didn't even hesitate when I told them, "No, they're actually out of town for the weekend." Holy shit, if you could slap a child, I would go back and slap myself silly. They exchanged glances between each other when the older-looking man said, "Well, I'm your landlord. We need to come inside and check a few things out for a minute." And that's when I realized just how much trouble I was in. I knew my landlord personally. He was a friend of the family, and he was not either of the men standing before me. Thank God for some quick thinking, because I told them, "Yeah, alright, but I need to grab something first." Before they could reply, I slammed the door shut and deadbolted it. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed my mom's number. I remember crying, thinking, "Please pick up, please." When she did, the second I heard her voice, I broke down sobbing. "There's 2 guys at the front door and they want to come in. One of them said he's the landlord, but it's not Mario and I'm scared. Come home now." I heard pounding begin on the window. My mom must have heard it too, because next thing she said to me was, "Dad's on the phone with the police right now. You need to tell them that. Shout at the top of your lungs that the cops are on their way. They know you're home alone and they need to know you won't be for long. I'll be there soon." My parents were an hour away. How they made it home as fast as they did in 20 minutes, I'll never know. Through my tears, I yelled to the men as loud as I could that the cops were on their way. Hey, we weren't gonna hurt you. No need to cry. It's okay. We'll leave." Then there was silence. It seemed like a lifetime, but it was no less than 10 minutes later when the police arrived. I'll always remember the female officer who spoke with me that day. She calmed me down and applauded my quick thinking on shutting the door. She told me to never open the front door again unless it was someone I knew, and even then not to do so if I was home alone, which I wasn't for a very long time after. My parents pulled into the driveway like a bat out of hell, and my mom hugged me tighter than she ever had before. I was crying, she was crying. I got a big lecture on opening the door for strangers and how lucky I was to be alive. My brother got an even sterner scolding and got grounded as well. Not that he cared much. He moved out shortly after. The cops took a report and surveilled the area for the 2 men, but they never did find them. I learned my lesson that day. I have no idea who they were or what their true intentions were, but I don't care to ever find out. When I was in my early teens, my family moved from the city out to the country. It was quite the transition going straight from a city life to living in a house that was at least a 15-minute drive from the nearest one over. My dad, however, had always dreamed of being a farmer, and since we were extremely comfortable financially, he was able to take a chance and pursue that dream. I had one older brother and one younger sister. Being the middle kid, I often had to feel like I was the bridge between the two. My brother was 16 at the time, and even though he was a pretty decent kid for the most part, like most older brothers, he occasionally liked to pick on me and my sister. I'll come back to that in a bit. My sister was 7 when we moved into the new house. It was a nice brick house on a ranch with a very large basement. The basement was half finished, meaning it had cinder block walls but still wasn't in any way exposed to the outside. It didn't have any carpeting or sheetrock like the rest of the house. My dad and my mom put all our toys down in the basement. It was officially our playroom, sort of. Not long after we moved in, though, my sister began to act very strangely. She began talking to herself when she was in the basement alone. The first time it happened, my parents asked her what was going on. She told them she'd made a new friend, Gus, an older man who liked to visit her in the basement. At first, my parents were quite alarmed, thinking someone must have broken into the house. It didn't take very long for them to determine that Gus seemed to be nothing more than a figment of my sister's imagination, though. Gus became a regular topic of discussion concerning my sister. She would bring up all the times he would come and talk to her in the basement. Often, I would hear her talking to this Gus. I would go down and check, just to see if anyone really was down there. Conveniently, though, whenever I asked her, Gus had always left immediately before I came down. While the talking about Gus didn't really bother me, as I never had any imaginary friends myself and didn't understand why anyone would want to, my brother was sick and tired of hearing our sister talk about him all the time. He would just get aggravated at her and tell her to shut up about her dumb and fake friend. About 5 months later, our parents were in town and my brother was supposed to be watching my sister and I. My brother had this weird and annoying habit that whenever our parents weren't at home, he'd sneak into my parents' room and try to grab my dad's porno tapes. Then he would set them up and watch them in the middle of the living room. He did this because the picture window in the living room faced a long driveway, and he would know when my parents were coming home. My sister and I were always forbidden from going in there. Not that I would have wanted to at that age anyway. On this day, my sister had once again been downstairs talking to Gus. I was in the kitchen grabbing myself a snack. Unexpectedly, my sister sprinted up the stairs and into the living room, surprising my brother. He had to very quickly shut the TV off. "Hey, Gus told me you were watching bad movies. You better stop that," my sister yelled at him. "Oh my God, I'm so damn sick of hearing about this Gus," my angry brother yelled in response. "There's no such person. Stop being an idiot." Of course, my sister got upset. My brother had made her cry. I came to her defense and told him that her talking about Gus didn't really hurt us in any way. He got irritated with me and told me I was encouraging her to act foolish. When I continued to defend my sister, my brother got up and grabbed me by the arm. "Oh yeah? Fine. Well, why don't you spend some time down there with him then?" He began to pull me over to the basement door. Now, I spent a lot of time in the basement by myself, so I wasn't really scared to be down there. Still though, no one likes to be forced somewhere they don't want to be. I struggled, but of course there was no way I could overpower my brother, who easily dragged me and shoved me down to the basement. Once I was in, he locked the door and yelled at me to make sure I say hi to Gus. I was so pissed off because I didn't want to be in the basement. I suddenly remembered that there was an outside door. There was a stairwell on the side of the house that led into the basement. The door at the bottom was locked from the inside. Feeling smart after having outwitted my brother, I turned to walk to the stairwell. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a grown man standing in the window of that door in the stairwell, staring down at me. He held up his hand and gave me a little finger wave. Then he took off. Now scared shitless, I ran up the stairs to the inside door my brother had locked and began to pound on it, screaming at my brother to open the door. I was yelling there was someone in our yard. Finally, I was able to get my brother to respond and let me out. I told him about the man in the stairwell. He sprinted out into the yard to look around. but of course no one was there. He initially chalked it up to me just wanting to give him a hard time about being an asshole, but when I described the man to my sister, she smiled and said, "Yeah, that was Gus." It was really freaky. I mean, I don't know who Gus was or if he meant my sister any harm. According to her, she never saw him again after. For months on end, though, my sister had been playing with an imaginary friend who was anything but imaginary. The only time my family ever moved when I was growing up was shortly after my youngest brother was born. There were already 4 of us siblings, and not nearly enough bedrooms to go around. My parents ideally wanted us all to have our own rooms as we got older, so they bought a 3-story Victorian-style house. Having a 3-story house was pretty damn neat, and I actually still own the house today. Definitely having my own bedroom for the first time ever was the neatest thing of all, though. There was 1 bedroom and 1 study on the top floor of the house, along with a bathroom. Then there was a door that led to a staircase that took you into the attic. It wasn't one of those attics you could live in, though. It was more of a place to store things in. That was really about it up there, though. There was no real ceiling either, just the pink insulation under the roof. In typical horror movie fashion, there were several things stored in the attic that the previous owners of the home had left there. Most of it wasn't anything of interest, though. Boxes of old books, tons of boxes full of National Geographic magazines. There was a desk with a vanity mirror on it and some poles with old clothes hanging down from them. I took the bedroom on the top floor, simply because I thought it was the coolest room. It had a big outside window with a cushioned couch to sit on. I really liked it. None of my other siblings fought me for it either, because it also happened to be the smallest bedroom in the home. I didn't really mind though, because it was so cool. About 2 weeks after we moved in, I was laying in bed when I heard what I thought sounded like music coming down from the attic. I mostly dismissed it the first time. I figured it may have been coming from one of the other bedrooms, and I was simply confusing it as coming from above me. This, however, changed when the following night I heard the same song once again. It was an extremely faint tune, definitely coming from somewhere above me. The following day at breakfast, I asked my family if any of them had been in the attic the night before, or the night before that. They all seemed surprised at the question. When I told them I heard a small tune being played up there, they all just chalked it up to my imagination. How typical, huh? Well, the tune ended up not going away. I heard it again and again for the next several nights. It didn't play all night either, only for about 10 minutes at the same time every night. I honestly believed one of my siblings was messing with me. Eventually, I decided I would keep an eye on the door one night and see if any of them had gone up there. I would know for sure they were messing with me then. After going up in the attic one night just to make sure no one was in there, I turned my bedroom light off and crouched beside the door. I watched and saw that no one had come or gone into the attic. But at around 11 p.m., I once more heard the song begin to play. I was a bit scared now, but extremely curious as to what was going on here. I decided I would go into the attic and find out. I was more than a little bit afraid now, but my curiosity overrode my fear. I crept out of my room and slowly over to the attic door. I opened it up and turned on the attic light. I went up the stairs and kept expecting someone to jump out and grab me at any moment. Once I was up the stairs, I was able to finally tell where the music was coming from. It was coming from that desk with the vanity mirror. Going slowly over to it, I noticed that one of the drawers was now slightly open. I pulled it open all the way and took a look inside. Placed directly in the center of the drawer was this small music box playing the tune. I picked it up and inspected it. It was a simple box with a lid on it, still playing as I held it in my hands. Lifting the lid, I could see that it had a glass top on it that showed you the inner workings of the box. When I turned it upside down, though, I felt my heart begin beating in my chest. There was a wind-up lever on the bottom of the box. There was no way it could play on its own, unless someone had wound it up, and that meant someone was in the attic with me. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave since I'd begun watching. Quickly closing the box, I sprinted down the stairs and woke my dad. I explained to him what I'd found. He came to the same conclusion I did. He grabbed a bat and went to explore the attic. What he found gives me chills to this day. In the attic, off to the very far end, happened to be a very small door that led to a cubbyhole. We hadn't noticed it before. When he opened the cubbyhole, there was a small old woman cowering inside. She had empty cans of food and water and smelled foul as hell. He closed the hole back up and held it closed while my mom called the police. The woman happened to be the sister of the older lady we'd bought the house from. She was quite mentally ill and couldn't bring herself to leave the home when her sister moved. Instead, she chose to hide in the cubbyhole and only come out when we were all asleep. I guess the music box helped to soothe her. I have no idea why she left it in the drawer rather than taking it into the hiding place with her. Who knows how long she might have been able to hide up there if I hadn't heard that music box. It was quite a weird event. You know, paranoia is a very strange thing. It can really cause you a lot of problems, actually. But paranoia itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It can help you out often. I came into a good sum of money about 5 years ago. Some inheritance money. I don't really want to talk about how I obtained it. It brings up some very bad memories. Needless to say, though, I suddenly went from not having much money at all to having quite a lot of it. I remember growing up and watching that show Press Your Luck. It's the one where you win big prizes and money by spinning a big board and doing your best to avoid a whammy. Well, there was this one guy on the show named Michael Larson who won about $100,000. He, for some reason, kept the money in all cash and lost $50,000 of it when people from the neighborhood broke into his house because they knew he had the money. A lot of people in my neighborhood were aware of my inheritance as well, and although I wasn't stupid enough to keep my money in cash, I was very scared that people might break into my house to steal from me, or worse. I decided to go ahead and have a security camera system put up in my home. I had a bunch of small cameras placed in every room. They remained up for an extremely long time. It seemed for the longest time that putting them up had been nothing more than a sign of paranoia, though. I did eventually have someone break into my house, sure, but that event was quite odd. Although the sliding basement glass door had been busted, it was obvious someone had broken in, but it wasn't obvious why they'd broken in. Nothing was damaged or missing other than the door. It was a really strange event. Then, I reviewed the security tape footage, and it got even weirder. On the tape, a person had fiddled with the door. Rather than busting it open, he was able to open it all on his own. When he walked in, he closed the door behind him carefully. He simply walked over to the security camera and stood there staring right at it. His head would sway from the left and then to the right, all while directly looking into the lens of the camera. A small smile eventually crossed his face. He stood there for a few more moments. After nearly an hour of doing this, he mouthed the words, "I'll come very soon." He then winked at me, thrust his hands in his pockets, and walked over to the door. He opened the door and then closed it behind him, only to violently smash it apart once he was outside. Apparently, he'd done this for no reason, unless it was his way of trying to let me know he'd gotten into the house. The videotape from the camera was his way to let me know he'd gotten in easily without making a single noise, and he could do it at any time. The police didn't know who he was, and they couldn't find him either. He never came back like he said he would. In a way, I wish he had, though. I mean, I was already paranoid before, but after watching that strange video, my paranoia gained a real face, and the longer time passed by, the more I expected him to come back and hurt me. Maybe he was just someone who wanted to make me paranoid, or maybe he's still out there and plans on coming back one day still. Who knows? I don't, but I sure wish I did. There's an abandoned house between my town and the town next to me on one of the country roads that connects us. I've been to it before, and even gone inside twice with my sister and best friend. It's an old house that dates back centuries, at least according to the bank records I was able to find. You can kinda tell just by the design really. The house is 2 stories with a basement, has loads of furniture and objects strewn about inside, and is far from empty. You can tell it hasn't been lived in for decades, and whoever had previously owned it, it seems almost like they just disappeared one day, leaving everything behind. The way I was able to get in the first time was through the cellar door in the basement. It's broken open and propped up with some big sticks. My first visits were around 2 years ago, and I hadn't gone back in all that time. Another friend, though, expressed interest in seeing the house when I told him about my experiences. So, last summer, I told him I'd take him over to it. I never thought it was a dangerous trip. I told him it was just an interesting place to explore. We parked across the street from the house, in the parking lot of one of the industrial buildings nearby. The road was a rural road, but it was far from unused. We didn't want to be questioned by anyone as to why we were there. My friend, being much braver than I despite my previous visits, led the way across the street and to the front of the house. He asked me a couple of questions about it and what I'd seen in there. I told him the kitchen still even had expired food in it, and the upstairs had a board game set up that I ended up bringing home with me. As we walked from the front of the house to the side leading to the back with the cellar, I made note that there was a lot more brush around than when I had gone last. I had gone in the spring those years before, and I never experienced this thick bush I was now carefully moving through. I pointed this out to my friend to be careful, as we both tried to figure out where the path to the cellar was. Eventually, we pushed a big bush out of the way and found the cellar, broken and propped open exactly the same as I had last seen it. We talked for a second about being nervous, and I really took in the view of the cellar. It led to this dark, abandoned house. I remember being really intimidated while looking through the opening. I made a note as well that some of the items propping the cellar door open were not familiar to me. I didn't state this out loud, however, as I thought it was either just my anxiety or perhaps some other explorer who had visited in the meantime. My friend and I discussed who should go first. He said that since I was the expert of the home, surely I should head down first. I was extremely hesitant, of course, but eventually, after a good 5 minutes of breathing and calming myself down, I started down the steps of the cellar. It was an awkward entrance. Half the cellar was collapsed and left little room for maneuvering. You had to duck under the part of the cellar door that was still put together, then inch your feet down the steps. Finally, turn your body sideways to fit through the small gap into the basement. It took a long time after ducking under the door, since my nerves came back for a second. I made it in just fine though, and my friend followed quickly behind. We stood in the corner of the basement now, taking it in fully. I turned my phone's flashlight on, and he did too. There was a spider web in the path to the stairs up to the first floor. I looked around and found some sort of tool to knock it down. I took the tool and swiped through the web. After that, I tossed it back on the floor. My friend and I talked quietly. I don't remember what about. We fell silent soon, though. Above us, I could clearly hear footsteps on the boards above our heads. It seemed like they were heading to the stairs that led down to the basement. I remember this part the best. As I looked at my friend, he didn't seem to react to the footsteps I was hearing. I looked at him, suddenly very worried. Before I could even say anything, he grabbed me. "We need to go now!" He turned around and practically jumped up the stairs. I remember thinking he was going insanely fast. I could feel his hand tugging me up. I was a bit slower, but I also got up pretty quickly. He pulled me out through the opening. I landed on my hands and knees after I escaped the cellar, and immediately stood up in the weeds. I turned around to my friend, who was crouched and staring down inside. I said to him that we should get out of here, and he turned away. He told me to go first through the weeds. I pretty much just ran through the brush, definitely getting cut up by some of them. We made it through them though and back to the front of the house fairly quickly. My friend kept urging me to go in front of him as he watched behind us. He switched to flashing his light in the windows of the first floor of the front of the house. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't really answer me, so I asked him if he'd heard the footsteps before we bolted out of the basement. He turned to me and said that he had heard them, and that's why he was watching the cellar to see if anyone was following us out. He continued to say that after he'd pulled me up, he turned to guide me away before he let go of my hand. When he turned back, he could see the bare feet of someone standing at the bottom of the cellar. Because of the cellar's dilapidated structure, he could only see their feet and part of their legs. He never saw them come up the cellar stairs, though, or move away from them before he followed me. I didn't believe him at first and thought he was just trying to scare me, but I could tell by the serious tone of his voice and the silent look he gave me after telling me that he was not trying to make a joke. We stood for a second, not really saying anything. We both agreed to go back towards our cars. We stood by them for a while, watching the house to see if anything or anyone would come out, but there was no movement at all. After talking for a bit about how crazy that was, and him reassuring me he was telling me the truth, it started to rain. We decided to call it a night. I haven't gone back to the house since then. I like to tell myself that whoever was in that house must just be a homeless person finding shelter or something, but I still get chills to this day, thinking about how close that person was to me as I scrambled up from the cellar. There's this hotel by the Bulgarian seaside, in which we have an apartment. To be honest, that's a very strong word for it. It's basically just a big room with a giant bed, refrigerator, and big windows on both of the walls. I guess it also has a small bathroom as well. It's on the ground floor, and again, both of the walls are facing the parking lot of the hotel. Despite all of this though, it's perfect for me alone. It's situated right next to the beach, and that's why I've been spending some of my summer vacations there recently. So, July 3 years ago, I'm spending a week with my ex-boyfriend there, and 3 to 4 weeks alone by myself after that. My ex always said that the owners of the hotel were a bunch of creeps. Whenever we went out of the room, he had to walk a path passing through the reception, where they used to sit all day doing nothing. The old dad in his 60s, I guess, his son Crumb, who was about 40, and his daughter, who was 45. Her husband would also sometimes join them. When you'd pass by, they'd just all get silent immediately and stare at you, every single time. I was used to this behavior after a while, but the boyfriend was very irritated, especially when he caught Crumb staring at my ass and smiling. After that, he used to stare him down deadly, right in the eyes whenever he got the chance. Soon, my ex went back to the city. It was now the 3rd week I'd been alone. The night was extremely hot, so I opened both windows wide open and put the curtains above them to defend myself from being peeked at. After all, I was at the ground level and my bed was right below both of the windows. I woke up in the middle of the night and suddenly felt like someone was watching me. This happened for the next few nights as well. I'm easily scared and paranoid, but I was alone there, so I'd been telling myself to chill out. It must just be my crazy mind trying to scare itself. Some nights went by without problem. Meanwhile, Crumb tried to talk to me 2 to 3 times when I was off to the beach. It was around 1 a.m. now. I was falling asleep when I began to hear footsteps outside the path. It was not exactly strange. There were some people staying next to me at the same kind of apartment. Maybe someone was coming home or going out partying late at night. Then, though, the steps stopped really close by outside. I could hear all of this because of the opened windows. I was sitting in the bed now and listening when I noticed that the door handle was moving slowly up and down. I lost my shit but stayed quiet. I silently thanked myself for remembering to lock the door before I'd gone to bed. After a while of silently jimmying the handle, nothing happened and the person walked away. I closed the windows after that. I called my dad and told him what just happened. He told me to lock and close everything, and he'd come grab me in the morning. It's a 5-hour drive. This was 3 years ago. Last night we were having dinner together, and my dad said, "Hey, do you remember your sea adventures?" He proceeded to tell me he had made his own little investigation back in the day and asked the owners of the hotel for security camera records. They checked the ones in the parking lot and saw a male figure skulking around. The part with the door handle was not in the camera range, unfortunately. My dad remembers my strange midnight waking up routine and told them to check the older records as well. In each of them, they saw a man peeking through my windows, trying to grab through the curtains, standing like that for 15 to 20 minutes each time. The woman finally recognized her brother and told my dad he had mental disabilities. She begged him not to press any charges and that they'd promised to take better care of him and look after him from then on. My dad, being a good guy, did not press charges. It appears that now we're selling the apartment. So, anyone interested in buying, perhaps? I was 19 years old, and the only female working at a shop specializing in automotive batteries and things of that nature. I had been working there long enough to realize that most of the clientele was male, and oftentimes that made for some awkward situations. For instance, I would get talked down to and patronized quite a bit, or flirted with to the point where I would be somewhat uncomfortable. I have a really thick skin though, thankfully, so most of the time I typically wasn't very bothered. One day, during a particularly busy rush, a very tall and well-built man, who was maybe in his mid-30s, came in through my line. I consider myself to be pretty good at reading people, and this guy was giving off some very, very strange vibes. Something about him seemed a little bit off. However, it was my job to be professional and assist whoever came through my line regardless, so I brushed aside those uneasy feelings. I just wanted to ring this guy out and get through the rest of the line that was now trailing out the front door. I greeted and talked to him as I would any other customer while I was processing his transaction. Things were going pretty fine actually, until he realized I was almost done. He started stalling and making up weird excuses as to why he couldn't use certain credit cards. Now he needed me to put his battery on hold. He would come back later, etc. I told him I would hold it for him and he could come back whenever he found the time in the future. I figured he would just leave at that point, but instead he stood there and stared at me. Now that I think about it, it was more like he was staring through me rather than at me. I was a bit uneasy, but I kept my polite and professional demeanor. Sir, if you're not purchasing anything at the moment, may I ask you to please step aside so that I can assist all these other customers? He completely disregarded my question though, and in a slow, raspy voice, he asked, "So, what's your name?" I didn't wear a name tag specifically for reasons like this. Customers had found me on Facebook before in the past, and it was quite unsettling. Thinking quickly, I threw out my nickname instead. "It's Rhea." "Rhea," he said, as he kept on staring through me. I smiled awkwardly. "Yep, that's me." By this point, my manager had realized what was going on and proceeded to ask the man to step aside as well. After hearing it from my manager, the man walked to a corner of the store by some shelving and continued to stare while I wrung the rest of the customers out. A bit of time went by, and the line had since cleared up, but he was still standing there, staring and now smiling the most sickening smile I think I've ever seen. It made my skin crawl. Of course, my manager and coworker saw this as well. My coworker grabbed my arm and said, "Come on, dude, let's go to the back instead." As we were walking into the stock room, my manager walked over to ask the man if there was anything else he needed. The man muttered that there wasn't and left. I wish that was the end of it, but of course he had to come back in to purchase the battery. When he came back the next day, we again had a long line. He even let people go ahead of him and waited until I was completely free before coming up to the counter to make his purchase. I greeted him again and tried my best to remain professional, but it was hard considering how creeped out by this guy I was. I was met again with that same vacant stare and that freaky fucking smile. I can't remember exactly the entire conversation, but at some point the questions he was asking became weird and inappropriate enough for my coworker to cut in on my behalf. He looked at the guy, then over at me. "Hey Rhea, why don't you go take your break instead?" He basically pushed me out of the way and rang the guy out instead of me. I stayed in the back until my manager came and got me, telling me it was safe to come out. We were all pretty weirded out by this, but of course, that would be the end of it, right? A few days went by. We had all mostly forgotten about this creepy dude, until he walked in again. This time, though, he didn't even look through the store. He didn't approach the counter. He didn't say a single word to anyone. He just stood in the back, pulled his hood up over his head, and hid in the very corner of the store, staring at me and smiling. His smile had become even wider and more sinister looking. At this point, I really started to freak out. I started shaking and feeling sick to my stomach. My manager came and screamed at the guy. "Hey you, I'm sick of you coming into my store and pulling this crap. If you're not gonna buy anything, get out." The creep paid him no mind though. He kept on staring at me. This, of course, pissed my manager off. He walked out from around the corner and told the dude, "Look, man, if you don't quit coming in here and staring, I will not hesitate to call the cops. What you're doing is harassment, so get the hell out of my store." At the mention of the police, this dude's smile turned into a snarl, and he slowly sauntered out of the store. We never saw him again after that, but I was immediately taken off closing shifts, due to the fear that the man would come back and try to catch me when I was there alone. I've definitely dealt with my fair share of creeps at that job, but this guy was by far the most disturbing. At about 8 p.m. last night, yeah, what a spooky time, I was walking with a friend of mine, Sally, about a mile to the closest cafe. We're both girls in our early 20s. Neither of us own cars, and Sally didn't have her Opal card, which is the Aussie version of an Oyster card, basically an automatic ticketing system for public transport. This meant that walking was our only option. It's summer over here right now, so it was still fairly well lit. We were walking down main roads as well, so we weren't too concerned for our safety. We finally arrived at this cafe and sat down together. I was paying, but I only had my credit card with me. Sure enough, the restaurant was cash only. Sally was on the phone when I got back from the counter, so I gestured for her to stay put and guard the spot while I went to go grab some cash. This was my home suburb, so I know there's no ATMs around. My best bet was a gas station about a block away. I'm doing a light jog so I wouldn't keep Sally waiting, when a balding, sweating man, probably in his late 40s, with a tank top and no shoes, came running behind me as I passed the corner of the block. He began walking behind me for about 100 meters. I really didn't think too much of it at first. The gas station was the next building along, and it seemed like he had just come out of a very nice suburban house along the street. It wasn't the witching hour yet either, so I just assumed he was in a hurry to get to the gas station like I was. He didn't even cross my mind as I entered the tiny convenience store, nor did he attempt to follow me in. In my peripheral vision, I could see him walk right past the door and out of sight. I began to look around for an ATM that they sometimes have inside. No such luck, unfortunately. I went up to this man in his 30s behind the desk and reluctantly asked if they were able to do cash out. He smiled politely at me. Of course. Is that man with you, by the way? I have no idea who he's talking about at first. He pointed to the man from earlier, though, who was now pacing around outside the store. Keep in mind, he didn't look at all menacing. He wasn't just going back and forth right outside the door or anything. He was drifting in the space outside, from the pavement to the gas pumps to the storefront, seemingly aimlessly. I assumed he must be on drugs or something. I told the clerk no, not thinking very much of it at all. "Oh, well, he was really staring at you before, you know. I thought he might have been your dad or something." I laughed it off. Honestly, I was not too concerned. He was just ambling around outside. I couldn't imagine him having a fixed gaze on anything. I thanked the clerk for the cash, but before I turned away to leave, he said, "Why don't you just wait here for a second? Let's see if he leaves first." We waited there for a few minutes together in silence as the guy began to pace back and forth directly against the front wall of the store, looking straight ahead and never inside. It still looked like the man was just on a drug-induced shamble and seemed harmless. Not once did he seem to even attempt to look at me, so I figured it would be safe to just slip out the door and walk back to the cafe in the fairly bright light of dusk, especially since Sally was texting me at this point, rushing me to come back. I thanked the guy at the desk once again for his concern, and assured him that I did not know the guy and was not involved in some weird scheme to rob the store or something. As I started to head for the door, the clerk called out and asked if I wanted him to walk out with me. I said I should be alright, and began walking away from the block. As I left the store though, the drifting man stopped pacing immediately, and began to make a beeline for me from the other end of the building. I seriously hadn't given a single thought to this guy at all up until this point, but for the first time he was now heading in a straight line toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood straight up. I started power walking so he wouldn't think I was actively trying to escape him, still trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid and should be more casual instead. I didn't look behind me to see how close he was. I'd reached the pavement on the other side of the gas pumps when I heard the store clerk sprint outside. "Go! Run!" I made a break for it, looking over my shoulder. He'd grabbed the man by his arms from behind. The balding man was not even glancing at the attendant or trying to escape. He just stood there watching me run away. That's pretty much the end of the story, folks. I kept running until I crossed the road, then turned around and stood still. The cashier was now holding firmly onto the odd, staring man. We shared a brief glance in bewilderment, not really knowing what to do. He made a hand gesture to go. I gestured my thanks and ran away. I got back to Sally with the cash and bought the food, before walking back home a different way. To set the tone for this, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college, and very quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of not-so-decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently. There were shootings all the time in broad daylight. Robberies, kidnappings, you name it. For the first 3 years, I lived with roommates on a side of town that wasn't particularly awful. It was just a bit sketchy. How lucky. When I was making decent enough money, I decided to move out on my own. The house was tiny, maybe 500 square feet if that. It was super old and poorly built as well. I was the only person living there, so I didn't really mind how small it was. What originally sold me though was that it was right in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and wooded areas, with only a scant few houses nearby. Considering I despised being in the town itself due to the continuous paranoia of being mugged or shot for no reason, I loved the idea of living where nobody was out there. At the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. A month went by and everything was still super good for me. I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place and spent large amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. This is in fact a detail that will be important later. After about 2 months of living there though, I started to notice things were out of place sometimes. Something to note is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as a storage space until he got moved himself. So he had a key to move his stuff there, but never really came by. He kinda popped in once every other week or so to maybe grab something from storage and usually let me know beforehand. Now though, I'd come home to my kitchen chair being obviously pulled away from my table, or a new bowl in the sink, things like that. They were such small, innocuous things, at first I wrote it off as my roommate swinging by, or perhaps something I'd forgotten because I was really tired. Then though, my dog started to develop this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He'd just lay on the couch and chew his toys all day. He never barked, never did anything weird. All of a sudden though, he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He'd literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and would not stop until I came back inside with him. He didn't want me to leave him there alone at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him, so I decided one day I'd put a movie in while I was out, thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task at work, and I knew I'd be home early that day, so I popped in a copy of Hamlet. I know, it's pretty boring, but I chose it because the copy I have is 5 hours long. I knew it would still be playing when I came back. Flash forward 3 hours though. Long before that copy of Hamlet should have been over. When I walked through the door, not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and all the appliances were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over. He wasn't even in town at the time. I explained the TV situation to him. He shrugged it off as the TV powering off when it idled for a while. Even though this could be true, there were several reasons I knew this wasn't the case. One, it was not idling, a 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. And two, even if it shut off by itself, my Xbox that was playing it wouldn't have turned off too. I had once left it on by accident for weeks while I was out of town or whatever, and it was still on when I came home, always, but everything was completely powered down this time. The weird thing was though, none of my stuff was missing. The door was even fully locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself perhaps it was a weird shortage with the Xbox or whatever, and shrugged it off. That is, until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier when I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she walked by the house while he was out, he'd start screaming and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me, and made me suspicious of her as well. I put some cheap alarms on all my doors, the kind that go off when they're opened, and slept with my pistol handy. The second night the alarms were on my doors, I was woken up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. Once I got there, it was shut though, and there was nobody around. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room though. The door would have had to been opened really hard for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and just landed there. The weirdest thing was though, the door was still locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my lock after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police wouldn't do very much, as I had no witnesses, no leads, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the lock shortly thereafter. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that, but I later found out my close neighbor that my dog now hated had previously lived in the house I was renting. The locks had never been changed. I have no way to really prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. The why though, I really can't figure out. None of my stuff ever went missing, not even the money. The most unsettling part for me though, is that she tried to come in at night until the alarm scared her off. How many times had she come into my house at night while I was asleep? And why had she done so? So, a few days ago, I got back from a family holiday in the countryside on a really nice property. I'm not sure if it was through Airbnb or some other similar company, but imagine that kind of thing. A fully furnished house with more or less all amenities provided. I have a fairly wide extended family, some of whom would be staying with us, some of whom wouldn't be, and some of whom would only be staying for a few nights before leaving early. My parents and I would be staying all week though, and we were the very first to arrive at the house. As I said before, it was a very good-looking property, not surrounded by other houses, but not completely isolated either. Because we were the first to arrive, we basically got first picks on rooms, and were able to unpack and explore the whole place before everyone else even arrived. I got my own room on the first floor. For reference, I'm 18 years old. There's one room on the top floor with a bathroom attached. Going up there, the first thing that struck me was just how hot it was in there. There were windows through which the sun was shining in, which I thought might be the source of this heat, so I shut all the blinds, but it didn't really get any cooler. Aside from the bathroom, there was another door in this room, but it was locked from the other side. It goes without saying that this was kind of weird, not the least because I had no idea what could possibly be on the other side of that door. There was a locked door downstairs too, but that one had an obvious keyhole and was very clearly a boiler room due to the sounds I could hear on the other side. But with this room, I just really had no idea what it could possibly be. There was also a small crawlspace door upstairs. It didn't have a lock or handle or anything like that, but I couldn't figure out how to open it. I'm not sure how relevant that crawlspace really was to all of this, but I thought I'd at least mention it as somewhat suspicious. Anyway, after a few hours, other family members arrived, including my grandparents who, being the oldest in the family, and so the most respected, got to choose a room as well and chose upstairs. Despite the fact that my grandparents are both in their 70s, they're both extremely fit, not just for their age, but for anybody really. They keep very active, and they don't get scared very easily at all. I couldn't say I really envied them taking that top room though. I'll skip most of the other details about the holiday since they aren't really relevant to the story itself, and fast forward to the first night. The property had this large garden, like really big. People at one end would have to scream for someone at the other end to even hear them. What made the property even nicer to me was there was a large hot tub out back by that garden. On the first evening, 11 p.m., I was in the hot tub by myself. Most of the other people had already gone to sleep. Having all the lights out and just sitting in the bubbling water, the only sounds audible to me were the buzzing of the jets and the chirping of the crickets. It was quite the serene experience. Just barely over the sound of the water, though, I could have sworn I heard something moving down on the other end of the garden. There was no way I could be sure of that, though, since it was so far away. I turned on the lights in the tub to as high as they could go, but obviously that didn't provide me with very much in the way of visibility. Looking back, it was actually probably a pretty stupid move because it made me more visible. I still couldn't see to the end of the garden, but now I kinda had the creeps. I realized just how exposed I felt, and decided to wrap up and head to bed. My room had these big glass doors that faced out into the back garden, which also made me kind of uneasy. I'd be lying though if I told you I heard any scratches on my window or something cliche like that. I actually didn't hear anything else and went to sleep perfectly fine. The next morning at breakfast though, I was talking with my grandma, who sorta dropped a bombshell on me. She told me that last night she had noticed a light turn on then off in the locked room upstairs. Not that I said anything, but this really freaked me out. I know the idea of someone secretly living in the house with us sounds dumb, and that's not really where my mind was going. Truth be told, I wasn't sure what to think. So that night I got totally drunk, like really hammered. I'm a bit of a lightweight and obviously not an experienced drinker, so it really didn't take much for me to get to that point. Regardless, I'm not exactly proud of the state I was in. I went out to the hot tub again, this time with my cousin who was a bit older than me, not even aware of my surroundings. The heat of the water combined with the effects of the alcohol made my brain basically turn into mush. I couldn't think clearly, and that's by my own admission. We were just listening to music and sort of chilling, when she suddenly pointed over at the other end of the garden to get my attention. "Hey, do you see that?" she asked. The garden had these automatic lights along one side, so if there was any movement they would turn on, illuminating one half of the lawn. From what I had seen, 2 of them, they weren't super sensitive, so you would have to get really close. I peered over the side of the tub but couldn't see anything in the dark. That's when my cousin had the bright idea to reach over the side and throw a football onto the garden. The sound it made as it thudded onto the grass still makes me feel sick. The lights flashed on, revealing a dark figure scurrying behind the fence at the back of the yard and just out of sight. We should have probably gotten out of the tub and went to bed at that point, or in reality called the cops, but for some dumb reason, we decided to go and investigate ourselves. She was a few drinks in too, I'll note. Not as much as me, and she keeps it down much better, but we both had some liquid courage going, if you know what I mean. Once we got there, it was too dark to see much, but the fence was very clearly broken, to the point where someone could easily squeeze through the gap in it and make their way onto the road adjacent to the property. That alone is creepy enough, but what really freaks me out is what happened the next day. For a little bit of context, I'm in the build-up to some really important exams right now, and just because I was on holiday didn't mean I would be cutting myself any slack in studying. Because of this, when my whole family went out that day, I stayed home to work. In my room, there was this rubber door stopper thing propping my door open, and a spare one in the drawers as well. I left the one propping the door open next to it, in case I wanted to keep the door open, or more realistically, keep it shut. Bear in mind that particular door did not have a lock on it. I kept the second one hidden under my bed in a really specific place you would never find unless you were deliberately looking for it, tucked away in the bed frame basically. The door doesn't close by itself, but if there's a draft, it will eventually slam shut after some time. At some point, I got very bored of studying and decided to go make myself a drink and get some snacks. What can you do? While in the kitchen, though, I heard this loud thud come from my room. Because of the way the kitchen was positioned, I couldn't actually see my door, though. At first, this understandably freaked me out, but then I heard the front door open. It was just my family. I put it out of my mind and returned to my room, only to see that the rubber door stopper was balanced on the door frame, just flush against the wall. I assumed it must have been someone in my family. I walked back in, only to see that the other stopper was still next to the door. I questioned my family at dinner. They all swore up and down they hadn't moved a single thing. This created some quite nasty implications, mainly that I had been home alone with someone, or perhaps something. I'm not sure which is scarier really. Luckily, nothing else of this nature happened during my trip, and needless to say, I was grateful just to get home. This remains the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I haven't told my cousin about the incident, since I figure I'd probably just sound crazy. I can only speculate too as to whether or not this was related to the incident from the night before. I'd like to think they're not, but I'm fairly certain about what I saw. My only advice to anyone using Airbnb or similar services is to thoroughly research the area you'll be staying in, and make absolutely sure the property is secure. This is a real story, but some of you might probably not believe me. I usually don't even talk about this because of the trauma, and the fact that people look at me like I'm crazy when I tell them about it. This was on the news too, but out of privacy and respect, I won't share the articles or the news clips here. Anyways, this story is about my intuition, and my friend's at times strange older brother. I'll call him Corey, and I'll call her Kara. I always used to play over at her house all the time, considering her mom and my mom were the best of friends. Back then, the whole neighborhood was basically a playground, and it honestly felt so much bigger as a child. The world can be a scary place, but I always had common sense, and that kept me in one piece, considering I was very accident-prone. Anyways, I'd play a lot at Kara's house, but I always had the weirdest feeling around her brother Corey. It felt like he was constantly watching me, and it made me very uncomfortable. He seemed to be popular, and everyone always hung out around him, but every time I was around him, I just felt very sick. He would do these things like kick small animals and make them yelp. He was very aggressive when he played with us too. One time he held my head underwater when we went swimming, and another time he watched me change in the bathroom. I noticed him after I got dressed, and saw the door cracked open. I didn't see him, but I felt his presence there. Sometimes it even felt like his own mom was scared of him. One day I went over to Kara's house when I was in middle school. The door was unlocked, so I just walked right in. I thought they were home because I smelled spaghetti cooking, and I loved Kara's mom's cooking. I turned around. There was Corey acting just like normal. Nothing rang a bell at first. I asked him where Kara and her mom were. He said they had just gone to the store. He said I could go into Kara's room and wait for her to get back. I almost did, but I felt him looming behind me as I was about to go into a room. This was normal, just like every other time, but for some reason I got terrified out of nowhere. It felt like I was suffocating, and my throat started to hurt, and tears started to form in my eyes. I turned around and looked at him, and all of a sudden I just started begging him to let me go with tears pouring from my eyes. We stood there for 5 minutes in suffocating silence, and then he just said I could go. I faced him as I slowly backed up toward the door and ran all the way back home. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he had already killed himself. Kara was found dead in her bed, and her mom was found dead in hers as well. He had stabbed them both to death. To this day, I still don't know why he let me go and didn't kill me too. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.